So I want to begin with start with one proposition, that the Jews are the people of the parallel text. The parallel text, the people of simultaneous translation. And that has a lot to do with the format of the handout for today, which is not at all incidental. So what do I mean by the people of the parallel text? Obviously, Judaism is a text-based civilization, but text always has to be translated. And as you probably know, one of the names of Yiddish is Teich, which could mean German, but it really means explanation. It means the meaning. And Yiddish was the language, the co-sanctified language of Ashkenazic Jewry for the simultaneous translation of the Bible, which little boys began at the age of 3. That was the curriculum, the simultaneous translation of the Bible. Vayomer, when er gesagt, ad Hashem, Gott, el Moshe zu Moshe, leimer azoi zu sagen, and you go back and forth and back and forth. In every Jewish home before the modern period, two of the most popular books were the Teich Chumash, which is the Bible in Yiddish, also known as Tzedamena, it goes under several different names, and the prayer book with a parallel Yiddish translation, which was called Mincha. So they have Hebrew names, but really these are Yiddish translations. I have led a lifelong campaign to keep this practice alive. I believe this is a critical practice. I work at it in the classroom and in my scholarship and also in my private life. This is a campaign I have been waging all my life, and I am very happy that in my Jewish sphere, 2 years ago, Sir Jonathan Sacks, the chief rabbi of Great Britain, if one can still speak about Great Britain, published a wonderful new translation of the prayer book, the Koren Siddur, where the layout is exactly the way you see it here. Now, what's the difference between laying out the text this way and the way it's almost always done? If you open a bilingual Russian or Ukrainian, I don't know, is there a Ukrainian Hebrew Siddur? All right, a Russian Siddur or an English or a any sacred or a Chumash, you will see that the Hebrew is on one side and the Goyish, the non-Jewish language, is on the other side, but it's on the wrong side. They are in the wrong side, so the only way you can actually compare is dyslexically. Your eyes are always going from one to the other, because the Hebrew goes in one direction and the English or Russian goes in the opposite direction. Why? There is no reason for this. This is a stupid, stupid convention, and this can be changed very simply. So here you have it, and it's beautiful because you have what is called in English a justified margin down the middle. Not only does it look straight and aesthetic, but for the eye and for the brain, it makes it very easy to go from one to the other, because they're right next to each other. So, what does this mean for us as readers? And it means that by having a parallel text in front of us, across a justified margin, it preserves a plurality of possible meanings. You have the original, you have the translation. It could be this translation or another translation, but your mind is already prepared to go back and forth across the page. And secondly, this tells you that the direction in which you read a text actually matters. The direction in which you read a text actually matters. So that is why in this handout, and this is actually the outline for everything that I'm going to do, I made two columns, and I distinguish between what I call reading from left to right and reading from right to left. Okay? So here you have it. Jewish languages are always written from right to left. That's the direction of the Hebrew alphabet. And all Jewish languages are printed. Well, the Judaismo then adopted the Latin alphabet, but classically, all Jewish languages preserve their written texts in the Hebrew alphabet. And then, whether you're reading a Russian translation, an English translation, a French translation, a Ukrainian translation, you're reading in the opposite direction. I would like now to expand on that and to build on that and say the following. That when we read from left to right, be it in Russian, Ukrainian, or English, we are adopting a mode of reading. We are reading through a particular cultural lens. And if we are in the university, I don't know how it is here, but I can certainly tell you that if you're learning in a Western university in the United States or in Israel, you are reading through the lens of theory, through the present moment, through our ideological concerns. The culture of the university is usually to read against the grain. It's edgy, it's subversive, it's critical. That's what we're taught. You're taught to think critically and to interrogate all the things that you came with, which is wonderful, and that's what the university stands for. It comes from the Enlightenment. I call that the left to right reading. If you are reading, however, in the opposite direction, from right to left, you're reading inside. It's a more integrative reading. It's more centripetal, moving towards the center. It's more linguistic. I would call that the culture of the Beit Midrash, of the house of study. I'm using these as metaphors, obviously, but and that's what I propose to do. I want to move back and forth across the justified margin. And we're actually going to go in this order. Across 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And if we're really disciplined, we'll get to the very end. Now, why adopt this bifocal vision? Why go to such lengths? I would say this is particularly useful for reading and understanding Sholom-Aleichem. Now, what's the formula that everyone always trots out about Sholom-Aleichem humor? Always quote the same thing, Gelächter durch Tränen. Yes? Gelächter durch Tränen. Okay, it's a formula, it's a cliche. But let's unpack it, because like all cliches, it has a great deal of truth. Otherwise, it wouldn't be repeated over and over again. So what does that mean? It means not one or the other, but one in dialogue with the other. Laughter through tears, that you only arrive at the laughter through a prior stage of discomfort, of tears, of pain. There is pleasure and there is pain. And somehow or other, Sholom-Aleichem is supposed to be the master of this. Now, since we are sitting here in Kiev, many of you will probably recognize that this was also said of another writer. It was said of Gogol. In fact, the actual phrase, laughter through tears, appears in the last paragraph of Gogol's Dead Souls. the canonical version, not the one that's lost, but the one that has been preserved. So there's this last paragraph where the author steps out of his narrative and he addresses the reader and uses that phrase. Now, wouldn't you know it? Solomon Rabinovich, who was raised in Russian culture, had copied out that last paragraph in his own handwriting, translated it into Yiddish, and kept it in a box on his writing table here in Kiev. And he called it my Gogol box. And what was his Gogol box? It was for work in progress, things that he was still working on. So he adopted that as part of his writerly self-image, that a writer has a box for work in progress, and in deference, in honor of Gogol, who was long dead, but who would exert a great influence on Sholom-Aleichem's writing, and hopefully we'll come back to Gogol at the very end. We won't forget about him. That phrase appears. So Sholom-Aleichem, in his, not just his unconscious, but even in his poetics, understood that he was following in a certain literary tradition created here on Russian-Ukrainian soil. Okay, so I am going to start with a left-to-right reading, which is the most common way in which this story has been read. So you're going to say, Professor Roskies, what are you talking about? This story has just been translated into Russian for the first time. We never heard of this story. What are you talking about? Well, I have news for you, that in the Anglo-Saxon world, this ranks among one of the most popular stories of Sholom-Aleichem's.
Really?
Yes, absolutely. It is one of the best-known stories of Sholom-Aleichem. And that is because of one book, which several generations of readers grew up on. It's called A Treasury of Yiddish Stories, edited by Irving Howe and Eliezer Greenberg. And it came out at a very critical time in the history of American Jews, 1954. It's one of the very first major literary anthologies to appear after the Second World War. And I don't have to tell you that the majority of Jews in America are the children of immigrants from Eastern Europe. And the book is dedicated, the dedication of the book is to the 6 million. In other words, this collection of Yiddish stories is a monument to the 6 million Jews. And it is the monument. It was considered to be and received as a major cultural statement. Now, Irving Howe and Greenberg began, it's not an entirely chronological survey, it's loosely chronological, but it begins with the three fathers. You'll forgive that, and it's Mendele, Sholom-Aleichem, and Peretz. And later on, 30 years later, he will write his book, his famous book, The World of Our Fathers, which is about the Lower East Side and the Jewish labor movement. So it's very gendered. There are no mothers. There's only fathers. It's a male lineage. Be that as it may, the story that first represents Sholom-Aleichem as you open the book is on account of a hat. So there it is, staring you right in the face. I should also say that it is through this anthology that Isaac Bashevis Singer became world famous. Because Irving Howe commissioned from none other than Saul Bellow a translation of Gimple the Fool, which appears towards the end of the anthology. And it is on the strength of that story that Isaac Bashevis Singer became a very famous writer. So much could be said about this anthology, but I can't go into it. What I can share with you, however, is why Irving Howe fell in love with this story. And he will define for us the most prevalent reading of this story in the Anglo-Saxon world, which is what I call a socio-psychological reading. That is to say, taking the main character, Sholem Shachne Rattlebrain, Sholem Shachne Drezich, and looking at him as a type. And here's what Irving Howe has to say. Why did I choose this story? Because it displayed Sholom-Aleichem's gift for making a seemingly innocent anecdote into a remarkably shrewd and poignant evocation of the whole social position. The key word is social position, the constant burden of peril of the Jews. The constant burden of peril. Schwer zu sein ayid. And this may come as a surprise to you, but this is how Irving Howe, who was a former Marxist and was very interested in literature as a tool of political thought, so he would choose, it stands to reason, that he would look at this story through the lens of social reality. Who is Sholem Shachne? He represents, no more and no less, the poignant evocation of the whole social position, the constant burden of peril of the Jews. So there is something precarious about the Jewish existence. And based on this story, Irving Howe creates a whole theory of Yiddish literature that it is a culture of the powerless, of the little man, whom he calls das kleine Menschele, even though in Mendele it means something else, but it doesn't matter. So he actually uses that Yiddish phrase, das kleine Menschele, the little person. The Jew who is absolutely powerless, the perennial underdog, the anti-hero. So, the reader, before the reader even begins to read, is already geared up to see this story and read it in a certain way. Sholem Shachne. Is he a Schlemazel? Is he a Luftmensch? Is he a Klein Menschele? What's his problem exactly? Okay. Is he a victim? Yes, he is a victim. Is he a victim of his social condition, as Irving Howe would say? Okay, so the problems that he faces are the problems of the Jew living in diaspora, the social condition, or, this is not what Irving Howe is interested in, but the next generation of readers, who comes later, will say, maybe it has something to do with his character. Not so much the social, but the psychological. Maybe he's got a screw loose. Maybe there's something about him characterologically that makes him do what he does. Okay. Once you're interested in this question, then the focal point of the story, the part that's most exciting, is what happens when Sholem Shachne arrives in this Lodiivka train station and he sees that the only seat, the half available seat is occupied by buttons, by this Tsarist official. Who could he be? And he's full of fear and trembling. That confrontation is obviously going to be the whole focal point, right? And it's wonderfully dramatized. Okay, so that's going to be really important. If you're interested in Sholem Shachne as an instance of Jewish powerlessness, you know, the condition, the constant burden of peril of the Jews, because he convinces himself that not only is he could be Porishkevich himself. I mean, the worst anti-Semites could be sleeping here on the bench, which of course makes no sense at all. What would he be doing sleeping on a bench in this Lodiivka train station? All right, never mind. Okay, so that's one possibility. If, however, you're not so interested in social condition, but you're really interested in getting at his character, then what would you focus on in this story? Well, there's a lot to go by. Because what happens immediately thereafter? He falls asleep. And we enter into his unconscious. Whoa, that's great. Sholom-Alейхем is letting us into his unconscious fears at that particular moment. Not just what he does and says, but what is he dreaming? What does that nightmare actually tell us? That's the first scene. And then the climactic scene where Sholem Shachne faces himself in the mirror and doesn't recognize what he sees. That moment of cognitive dissonance. What? How do we explain that? Okay. So much ink has been spilled over this. There's a rich literature about this story. I am building on the shoulders, standing on the shoulders of the greats. I have written 3 articles about this story, and I will be writing about it until my dying day. But I'm not the only one, believe me. So 2 critics writing in English say the dream sequence, it prefigures his downfall, and it shows you the extent to which he is the victim of his essential character. He has only himself to blame. We have to look for the fault lines inside of his own character. He's not a shlemiel, but he's a shlemazel, and no love lost for this man. So, okay, so, you know, do we like Sholem Shachna? What makes him so weird, behave so strangely? Well, he's very nervous, very high-strung, right? But also, he's completely a rattlebrain. He doesn't, he's always worried about different things. So, you could say, well, this is a psychological portrait of a nudnik. This guy's just a nudnik. I don't really like this guy. I wouldn't want to invite him over for dinner. He's so self-absorbed, and he's so insecure, and he's always carrying on, and goodness me. Or, you might not say that at all. You'd say, here's a guy who hasn't accomplished very much in life, to put it mildly, but he's so full of energy and optimism. He just picks himself up and moves on. I mean, even after this terrible debacle, where he jumps off the train to wake himself up and misses the only train that will bring him home for Pesach, and spends 2 days among strangers for the most important holiday of the entire year, he comes home and he denies the whole thing ever happened. He tries to cover it up. Unfortunately, there are no secrets in Kasrilivke. Everybody knows what really happened. But if left to himself, he would. This is not him telling the story, after all. He's not. He only gets to tell a very small part of the story. So maybe there's something positive, admirable about this man. And certainly he's hilarious. I mean, his response, the way he works himself up, just to lie down on a corner of a bench against some low-level official, because what Russian Tsarist official would be traveling and sleeping on a bench? It could only be the lowest level. He works himself up into such a lather, he has to give himself an almost hysterical pep talk. Who the hell is Buttons? What do I care? He could be whoever he wants. Don't I deserve a place to... Yes, I'm going to... Damn it all. I am going to sleep no matter what. I also have sleep coming to me. So there's a complete disconnect with this, all the psychological energy that he has to muster. Why? For nothing. Just for something, you know, that any normal human being would say, okay, fine, so there's a little place, I'll lie down on this part of the bench. So what? What's this whole business? Why does he have to get himself all so worked up? And then everything starts going wrong. And he not only, and then everyone starts bowing to him, Your Excellency, and he's completely nonplussed, he has no idea. And then finally, when he gets into the first-class compartment, he says, why are they giving me so much honor? Can it be because of the real estate deal that I just clinched? What, are you crazy? Oh, and then he says, no, that couldn't be, because how would they even know that I clinched a real estate deal? All right? And then the last thing he does is the most absurd, is he jumps off the train in order to wake himself up, because Yarama woke up the wrong person. Okay. So you see, it's very rich. You can also see that I'm personally more interested in the psychological than the social, because I gave it more time. and I got more worked up about that. But, you know, this is very rich material. And what's more, if you do adopt a psychological reading, well, there are many schools of thought. It doesn't have to be just Freudian psychology. It can be Bergson. It can be Lacan. It can be, one of my students, when I once taught this goes back many years, when I first taught in Israel at Tel Aviv University, someone wrote a paper on this paper based on the thinking of Winnicott, who was a British psychiatrist, and did a very sophisticated analysis of the story according to the theory of Winnicott. And then another student from the Sorbonne had just read a famous article by Lacan, L-A-C-A-N, about the mirror. Wow, perfect! He writes about the mirror. Well, here's a story where the mirror is the central object of disconnect. In other words, whatever, if this is one of the areas that you're excited about, taking a psychological approach, this story is for you. What do all of these readings have in common? What they all have in common is that they are emancipated from the Yiddish original. They have nothing to do with the right to left. You can access any of these interpretations without reading the story in Yiddish. You don't need the Yiddish. All you need is a good translation. Because you're interested in a very universal question, you know, either having to do with the character, or more particularly, if you're interested in the specific fate of the Jewish people, or the Jewish people as a stand-in for the powerlessness of the individual in the nation state, then that's good enough. You don't need to read the story in Yiddish. Okay, that's reading number one. Am I going too fast? Am I yours? So, okay, because this is basically, you know, you have the outline here. Okay. So now let's go to the other side. And what I would call a formalist folkloristic reading, which doesn't depend so much on Yiddish original, but it's reading it from inside the culture. Now, Irving Howe said, a seemingly innocent anecdote. A seemingly innocent anecdote. And he's right. Because even Sholom-Aleychem admits as much. Okay? We know that this is a well-known joke. So why would we celebrate that? Why would that be important for our understanding? Well, that would tell us that Yiddish literature and Yiddish culture comes from the folk. It's a vernacular culture, and obviously, vernacular means that things are passed on from person to person. And Sholom-Aleychem is the great master of that. He took that folklore and the verbal culture, the orality of Yiddish, and turned it into high literature. And you've all heard of the town of Chelem, right? Jews have even a whole town of foolish people. So it stands to reason that there would be jokes that circulated, and that this story is actually a retelling of an old joke. And here's the joke. And here's the joke. Now, I have it from a book, but I've also heard other people, when I once lectured about this in Montreal to a Yiddish-speaking audience, to whom, by the way, this story was not familiar. I was teaching them the story for the first time, because for a native Yiddish audience, the story is buried in a very obscure volume of the collected works of Sholom-Aleyhem called From Pesach bis Pesach. It's a potpourri of stories that have to do with the holidays. It's not even Maises for Yiddische Kinder, it's Maises from Yom Tov. It's a late volume that Berkovich, his son-in-law, threw together. Sholom-Aleychem didn't live to see it published as a book. So after my lecture, two people got up and said, I know another version of the story, and gave me another version. Okay. But here is from Druyanov, Sefer HaBedicha VaHachidut. There's a classic collection of jokes in Hebrew. You ready? Here's the story. It happened that a Jew and a priest, now get that, a priest, a galach, shared a room in the same inn. Okay, so a Jew arrives in the inn, and it's late at night, and the only place to sleep, he has to sleep next to a galach. Actually, it means probably a Russian Orthodox priest, right? Not a Catholic priest, but Pravoslavna. Okay, so just before going to sleep, the Jew says to the servant, "Please wake me up before sunrise. I have to make the morning train." Okay, fine. The servant does as he is told. It's very early in the morning, and the sun hasn't even risen. The Jew doesn't want to wake up the priest, so in the dark, he looks for his capote, his gabardine. But instead of his gabardine, what does he put on? The priest's habit. Okay? That's the original version. He grabs it, and no sooner, and then he rushes off into the train station, and just as he's about to catch the train, he passes a mirror in the train station. And in the mirror, he sees a man dressed in a priest's habit. And he scratches his head and he says, "Ugh, make that idiot of a servant roast in hell. I told him to wake me up, and he goes and wakes up the priest instead." That's the whole story.
Nice.
That's the whole joke. That's it. That's where he got it from. Okay. So, this is a wonderful joke, and it's a perfect Jewish joke, right? Because it's a joke about a nincompoop, who could be anybody, who confuses the clothing with the man, so it's a joke situation. But from a Jewish point of view, it's unthinkable of all the things that a Jew cannot be. Becoming a Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox priest is absolutely the other, capital O. It's impossible, right? So, obviously, he doesn't recognize the face in the mirror. And then, and then you laugh, you have a cathartic laugh, and you know, well, that's impossible. It's only a joke. Okay, and then you go on with your life. Okay, so, the year is now 1913 when the story was written. Sholom-Aleichem is no longer living in Russia. He's left the mother Russia after the pogrom in Kiev here in October of 1905. And basically after that he's living in exile. So what does he do? He changes many things in the story. There's no inn. He modernizes it. He updates the story. How does he do that? So instead of an inn, which could be any time, the whole story is most of the drama situated in the train station itself, right? Not only is it about catching the train, but it's all about train travel, and it is narrated inside a train. And the two passengers are on the train going home for Pesach. So the train now becomes the medium of the story and structures the whole narrative. But that's the least of it. Instead of a priest, you have a tsarist official with a kokarde and a voyena, with a kolashok and a kokarde. Oh boy. So a military cap with a red band and a visor. So where are we? We are really in Tsarist Russia now, and this makes it much edgier, much more dangerous, right? Because this is a different kind of enemy. A different kind of enemy, and the social space is not the old-fashioned world where it's just Jews and Gentiles, where the source of Jewish powerlessness has to do with the social and political structure and the Tsarist regime. And then, in case you didn't know, he throws in this business with Purishkevich. And that will become important for the story later, okay? Who was a living presence at the time. We'll come back to him. Right now we're concerned with this story as a folk tale and as a joke. So obviously he's just taken the joke and he's embellished it. And part of our pleasure is if we recognize that we've heard this joke before. Because that's what folklore is. It's always recycling, taking things that are familiar. And every storyteller will tell it in a different way. So I think Sholom-Aleichem was counting on the fact that his readers would recognize it, which is why he goes into this whole business about, is it an anecdote? Was it true? Can I tell it? Do I believe it? Well, if he said it, well, and he's no writer, and he's not a professional writer, and he claims it's true, okay, fine. It's also built like a folk tale, structurally. You remember Vladimir Prop? Do you still read Vladimir Prop about the first of the early Russian structuralists? Anyway, so Vladimir Prop, in English, his name is written this way, I don't, you know.
Prop.
Yeah, Vladimir Prop, about the fairy tale, the structure of the fairy tale. So, what always happens, according to Prop, at the beginning of every fairy tale? The hero leaves home. The hero leaves home. Okay? Our hero leaves home, and he goes off into the world to clinch a real estate deal. And we don't know where that is. Somewhere out there on neutral ground, he accomplishes something. He does something. In fact, for the first time in his life, he's never closed a deal. But this time, Baruch Hashem, he closed a real estate deal. He's very happy. Okay. So, on the strength of this great victory, he's now going home. I've accomplished something, right? Now I'm going home. I'm the conquering hero, yes? But it's a folktale. There is going to be a serious test. He's going to confront the ogre. Buttons. Ooh, and where is this going to happen? On enemy turf. On some places very dangerous. Zlodeyevka's train station. It's dark. It's
the very name is good.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. He says, and the narrator throws in all kinds of interesting detail to tell us what a horrible. And we've all been in train stations like that. Certainly in this country, we know what it's like. Just imagine pulling in one of these places in the middle of the night. Okay. So, what in a fairy tale does a hero have to do in order to vanquish the ogre? He has to steal his source of power, his magical source of power. What is the ogre's source of power? His hat. Without his hat, he's nothing. Great, now I've got it. Goes off wearing the hat. Everything should be great. No, he's completely undone by the fact. Having been miraculously transformed, he fails at the ultimate test. He looks at himself in the mirror and instead of saying, "Whoa, look at me! Ha! Now I get it. Now I see why Varsha Blaharodya, Vasha Blaharodya, Vasha. Now I get it, I understand. What a laugh. They thought it was the... No, exactly the opposite. Who? What? Cannot be. Cannot be. I better go and wake myself up before it's too late. And he's punished. So, this is a folktale, but everything goes wrong here. And then the dream also makes sense, because that's a folktale convention. That in folktales, very often, the hero is most lucid when he's dreaming. And the dream is a portent, as it is in the Bible, right? This is very ancient, right? The dream tells him, you're going to lose this contest. You're going to lose this contest. And it's only through the dream that Sholem Aleichem, who is really a realist writer, introduces the element of the supernatural, unreality. And Sholem Shatner is completely confused for a very long time. Am I dreaming? Is this really happening? And when am I going to wake up? When am I going to wake up? Okay. So that's one of the ways that Sholem Aleichem preserves the connection to the folktale tradition. So, what are we doing when we're reading it formalistically or folkloristically? We're looking for the deep structure of the story. How is it really structured? we're looking for what Freud calls the uncanny, the familiar yet strange. That weird situation where we've been here but we've not been here, where it's familiar but it's also frightening at the same time. And we like this story because it illustrates Yiddish as a folk culture and Sholom-Aleichem as a writer of stylized, modernized folk tales. So that's good. We like that. That's very Hamish. Makes us feel good about him as a writer. Okay, so you see now how we're working here, from the outside and from the inside. And they're very different perspectives. Okay, next. Two comparative readings, one as a railroad story, RR stands for railroad, and the other as a holiday story. Okay, so, I already mentioned to you that Sholom-Aleichem updated it to 1913. Let me remind you what is going on in Tsarist Russia, why this is in 1913. It's a very bad year in general and for the Jews specifically. Jews are being expelled en masse from the villages, which is the last chapter of Tevidah Melchiker. That's why he's expelled, because all the Jews are being expelled from the villages. It's the end of the Beilis trial, held where? A few blocks away from here, on the other side of the city, right? Here in Kiev. Beilis trial, remember?
It's the very center of Kiev.
Mendel Beilis, it's happening here. Rasputin is in the Winter Palace, and the worst news of all, there's a group of anti-Semites called the Black Hundreds, who are using using anti-Jewish violence as a political tool, and it is led by someone named Purishkevich, and he's a big deal in the Russian Duma, a real historical character. Okay, so one of the tricks, one of the most brilliant things that Sholom-Aleichem did towards the end of his life, and it's one of his masterpieces, is he published a book called Eisenbahngeschichtes, Die Ksovim von a Komi Voyageur. He wrote most of it between 1909 and 1910. Railroad stories, the writings of a Komi Voyageur, which is of course a Russian loan word. In Yiddish, it sounds like Komisch Voyageur, and the stories are also... It's a terrible book. It's the bleakest work that Sholom-Aleichem ever wrote, because it's one story after another, after another, after another, of complete social and spiritual breakdown, crisis. These are stories narrated on a train by men who are by themselves, all by themselves, going nowhere. We may know where they're coming from, but we don't know where they're going, and it's not clear that they even know where they're going. And each story is worse than the next. And it's a panorama of social dissolution. Okay, so this story didn't make it, and doesn't actually belong into that connect. But Sholom-Aleichem's readers already were familiar with this genre. So when they pick up this story, when they read it in the newspaper, in the Yiddish newspaper, Erev Pesach, in the Erev Pesach supplement of their favorite Yiddish newspaper, they already understood everything about the symbolism of the railroad means modernity. Okay, this is a story about the modern condition, and obviously the two Jews on board the train, even though one of them is Sholom-Aleichem, who could afford to travel first class, is traveling third class. Why? Why is he traveling third class? What do you think? Why would he be traveling third class if he could travel in comfort? Real life, and he wants
Speaking to someone.
He wants to hear Yiddish.
Yeah.
First class, no one speaks Yiddish. It's passt nicht. You don't speak Yiddish. Okay. And he has actually. How do I know this? Because he has a story in the Eisenbahngeschichtes, which is called Third Class, where he does a linguistic breakdown.
Really?
Yeah. of what languages you'll hear in each class. So here's what he says. In first class, everybody sits in total silence. In second class, and now I'm going to introduce my terminology. You only speak Imperial Goyish. There's two kinds of Goyish. Imperial Goyish is Russisch, right? And there is vernacular Goyish. Thank you. That is right. How did you know? That's exactly right. Now, these are not linguistic terms. This is very ethnocentric. This is the way the Jew hears the world outside. So there are two kinds of Goyish. And for Sholom-Aleychem, this is extremely important. In second class, you only speak Imperial Goyish because you have to pretend that you're part of the social elite. And then there's this funny episode where a man is trying to make it with a girl sitting opposite him, and they're speaking to each other in Russian and trying to impress each other. And then it turns out, of course, that she's also Jewish. And the whole thing blows up in his face. But you'd never speak Yiddish, say. But in third class, Yiddish, morning, noon, and night. Nothing but Yiddish. So this is a complete invention. The idea is that in third class, only Jews travel third class. It is incredibly crowded. And is it noisy? Oy, gewalt. Everybody's talking at the same time. Okay, so we know this. This story is a little bit slower because it turns out that we're only interested in these two passengers. And, okay, and we don't even know who else is sitting around them. Okay. So, what makes this into a railroad story? What parts of the story deal with railroad travel? Well, this explains why Sholom-Aleichem has the storyteller, who is an anonymous merchant, go into a long digression, right, about train travel. You know, and it gives you all of the nomenclature of train travel. Okay. Yeah. So this is at the bottom of page 1, the bottom of the first page. Okay. So we'll come back to the telegram a little bit later. Let's not talk about the telegram yet. Ihr werdet schon versenken, voran bis mir kommt an Kinsladievke, weißt du noch, als ihr fort. Und als ihr kommt Kinsladievke, hat ihr a Peresiatke. Das heißt, ihr darf sich übersetzen auf der Neuerbahn. Was man hat uns a Teufel getan und zugeführt, kein Kasrilevke. Man darf ihr koidem bleiben stehen und etliche schon Leute Raspissanje. Oi me verspätigt nicht. Okay, so there's a whole vocabulary that you have to master. Peresotke and Raspisanya. Okay, this is all very new, and it looks to us like only men are traveling, which obviously is not true, but that's part of the literary image. And we are in technological time. The important thing here is the story begins. Two Jews are going home for Pesach, and they meet on board the train. One is this merchant, and the other, none other than Sholom-Aleychem. Can you believe it? How lucky he is? His traveling companion is none other than Sholom-Aleychem. And these two guys hit it off because they're two Jews essentially doing the same thing. They're on the train, going home, on schedule. They have no problem. They're going to get home on time for the Pesach Seder. And while they're going, I have a story for you, Mr. Sholom-Aleychem, like you've never heard. And whether Sholom-Aleychem wants to hear it or not, he's going to hear it from beginning to end, because this guy knows this is his once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to have Sholom-Aleychem's ear, and he's not going to pass this up for anything. He has a lot on his mind, and one of the things he wants to impress Sholom-Aleychem with is the perils of train travel. You think it's so easy to get home in time for Pesach? I want to tell you, Mr. Sholom-Aleychem, you know, in the modern era, with train travel, you would think, yes, with schedules and trains, And a train that now, for the first time in all of history, takes you directly to Kasrilivke. Is this going to make it easier for a Jew to get home in time for Pesach? Or harder? It's counterintuitive. It's going to be harder. We were better off without the trains. You just listen to me. Okay. So, Sholem Shachnik couldn't tell this. This is not part of his consciousness. That's why we need another storyteller here. Not just one, but several. Okay. So, if we're reading the story as a railroad story, that so-called digression, that aside, is not an aside. It's the key. Key to the meaning of this story is that we are living in the modern world. And ever since Anna Karenina, the symbol of modernity is the train. And the train is going to destroy the fabric of our society. And it's going to put you into confrontation with a world that you cannot handle, with a Tsarist official, with the buttons. And even in your worst dream, when he's falling asleep, what does he dream of? What's the nightmare? The nightmare is simply another version of what's happening to him in reality. Remember? In the nightmare, he's also going home, but by horse and buggy, the old-fashioned way. But even then, the Jew was not in control of his fate. Even when it's Ivan Zlody, your local goy, right? He's going slow. Come on already, come on, it's Pesach, Nasha Pascha, you idiots. Hurry up. So he does. And before you know it, he's driving out of control. Wait, I just lost my hat. How can I drive into town without my hat? Okay, so the world is driving out of control. You are not in control anymore. This is a runaway world. Whether it's Ivan Zlody or it's the train, you are not in control of your fate. And this is bad news. And if you think you're going to make it home in time for Pesach, you are sorely mistaken. Okay. So, you can therefore read this story politically, as a political allegory. If we're reading it as a railroad story, we would say, a Jew in Tsarist Russia can only be treated humanely if he's dreaming, or if it's a case of mistaken identity, right? Otherwise, you're just a filthy Jew, right? And even in your dream, Ivan is driving out of control, right? So you could say the story is about anti-Semitism, driving out of control. Political anti-Semitism is something radically new on the political horizon. That's why Purishkevich is introduced into the story. This is really a very bleak tale about oppression, living in the world of oppression. And it's bad news. Okay, but that is one side of the story. That's reading it from left to right. How about reading it in the other direction? In the other direction, Sholom-Aleichem actually gives us a little précis up here, which was translated into Russian. In English it doesn't appear, but in the Russian translation it does. Lekovat Pesach. There you go. The first words of the précis are Lekovat Pesach. Erzählt von der Kasrilivke Jiden, was handelt mit Roskies und räuchert dine Papiroslach und erzählt Tage mit sein Loschen.
Ja. Eine Frage?
Ja, Adler.
I and our colleague, we were reading with advanced students this in Yiddish, and then we got the translation. And now I see the same in English translation. Why Obrezkis is translated as paper cuts? Because in Russian, and might be also in Yiddish, Obrezkis can be also from bread, meat, kielbasa, yes. And it appears in English version. We don't, Natalia have looked in original work of translation. He doesn't give that it's papir, schnit or der Ebes.
Really?
This is the first.
So it means scraps. It means scraps, but it could be scraps of anything.
Just tell the story in Kiev at the beginning of 20th century.
Yes. Even in Russian we have such words. What do you understand in sausage obrezkis?
Obrezkis from sausage. For instance, in a shop you could buy a normal sausage, and you could, if you are poor, buy obrezkis from this sausage, or obrezkis from bread. These parts from bigger parts of bread. It has never. It's not only about paper.
Oh my God!
What could you do with paper cuts? Nothing.
Nothing. That's
with
right.
normal paper you could do something, but not with obrezkis.
Очень интересно.
This is yes.
That changes
And it comes in English, then it comes in Valery Dimsh's translation, and actually, as I see,
that's where he got it from.
The Yiddish version we have stands in forwards with this kind of brackets telling that it's from paper.
But that's what Sholom-Aleyhem does.
No.
No.
Who does? Where does it come from?
I have another version from.
Sholom-Aleyhem.
Yes.
And it stands there as papir cuts.
Yeah, here it says himself in the second paragraph.
But
Shtiklach papir.
this is taken from Yiddish forwards. This version of Yiddish text, no?
But this is the canonical. This is from
Natalia also has
another version of the story.
Yes.
You see?
Really?
Can we show you?
My goodness, that's fascinating.
It's like this.
Yes.
And it's without paper cuts. It's just.
But it says Shtiklach papir.
Natalia.
It does. It says right here Shtiklach papir.
Here.
It's in there. So somebody, Sholom-Aleyhem must have written that. Who else would have written it?
I don't think so, because the edition of 1925.
You know what? Okay, so now we have everything digitized. This question can be resolved. This question can be resolved. If you go back to the first printing of the story, I'll send you.
Could it be editorial thing?
It could be.
Here, he doesn't say Obrezkis.
Okay. It could be that Berkovich did that for the benefit of the American reader, who would not necessarily.
Because they wouldn't think that here people could eat Obrezkis from sausages, you know, or bread.
Okay. All right. That certainly changes a lot, because if it's paper, then it kind of connects him to writing, to the written word. And that makes the connection between him and Sholom-Aleyhem a lot stronger. That both of them are dealing with paper.
Might be also.
So that's why it's a very attractive reading. But I now see that it's not necessarily so.
Yeah.
Okay. So, if we read this as a holiday story, it reads completely differently. Okay, and Sholom-Aleyhem created the genre of holiday stories in Yiddish. He didn't invent it. He could have learned it from Charles Dickens, or maybe from other writers, but we know for a fact, he introduced this idea of writing stories in honor of the Jewish holidays. And his favorite holiday of all was Passover, Pesach. And coming home for Pesach is the plot of most of these stories. Okay, so I've read them all back to back, and I can tell you the following. Holiday stories have only two plot lines, only two possibilities. One is, on the holiday, a Jew is king for the day. King for the day. The rest of the year, he's just a dog. But on Pesach, or on Simchas Torah, he's up the head of the... That's one part, but most of the stories are a Verstärkter Pesach, the holiday that is ruined, where the whole plot builds up expectation, and then something happens at the end to destroy the holiday. Like well, deform. The little boy who was saving up for a flag for Simchas Torah. I won't tell you what happens, it's so tragic. It's a terrible story. And this is an example of the second. He's doing everything in his power to make it home for Pesach? No. And what's more, it's a story that takes place in Kasrilovke, which Sholom-Aleichem made up. Alright? Okay, so it's really, how do you negotiate from one point to another to make it home for the holiday, and you have to pass through this terrible place called the train station of Zlodiyevke. But maybe it's not about Pesach, maybe it's about Purim, because it's really hilarious, and it's a case of mistaken identities. Whatever it is, it's still within a Jewish idiom, within Jewish time. And it's going to bring us back to Jewish time and Jewish place. No matter what happens, he's going to finally make it home, and his families and everyone is going to put him back in his place. This is where Mrs. Sholem Shachner plays a very important role. That's what we're calling, I'm joking of course, his wife, Mrs., because she doesn't have a name. She's really mad at him at the end. Remember? Turn to the back, the last page. Okay? Page 4. His wife, she laid into him. And mind you, she didn't complain about his spending the holiday away from home. And she had nothing about the red band and the visor. She let that stand for the time being. She'd take it up with him later. The only thing she complained about was the telegram. And not so much the telegram, you hear what I say, but as that one short phrase, bez premieno, without fail. What possessed him to put that into the wire? Arriving home, Passover, without fail. Yedu, what is it? Bez premieno yedu pasku damoy. What possessed him to put that word without fail? Was he trying to make the telegraph company rich? And besides, here's the real question. How dare a human being say without fail in the first place? Okay, so that's...
Probably she has cursed him, and that's why the story has kept.
Maybe, maybe. But the women in Sholom-Aleichem are always the voice of fatalism, pragmatism. Their job is to take their men who fail and put them back in their rightful place. That's Shana Shengel versus Menachem Mendel. Okay? And the story does have a happy end because we're back home in Kasrilovke, where people still speak Yiddish, where failures can even find a refuge, where all the dreamers end up coming home anyway, but they're accepted back into the... where telling stories is the favorite pastime, because everybody is already telling the story and retelling it one to the other. Even the children. It's become part of the children's folklore. And where Jews constitute a majority. So, dangerous things will happen to you in the train station, but when you're home, you're safe. Even as late as 1913. Okay, so the holiday story is about homecoming. So look what the two possibilities are. This is really amazing how Sholom-Aleichem does this. If we are to read this as a late railroad story, then it's a story about exile. If we read it as a story about Pesach, it's a story about homecoming. Either way, this is a story about Jewish identity politics. Either somewhere between exile and homecoming. It's very precarious. Can you make it home on Pesach? That's one possibility, one problem. The other is, dare you drive into town without your hat?
No.
No, you can't.
If it is a Jewish town.
You can't.
And how?
You can't. Because you lose your hat, you lose everything. But if your whole identity is only about your hat, then it's very easy to lose that identity completely. So these things are very precarious, much more than you would have thought otherwise. So those are totally different readings of the story. One from one direction, which makes it very subversive and scary, and reading it from right to left, it's more a story about homecoming, and it's okay. And Sholom-Aleichem wants his readers to have a good laugh, and after all, he's publishing the story in a Yiddish newspaper on both sides of the Atlantic, both in Russia and in the United States. He has a readership that crosses the whole Ashkenazic world, and it's for Pesach. So you want a story that, in the end, is going to make you feel good. Okay. We're obviously not going to cover everything that we wanted to cover, so let me just outline some of the other possibilities here. Minority discourse versus a more narratological. Minority discourse is very hot in the universities. I don't know whether it is here, but that's what it's all about. And Yiddish literature is very often subsumed under that heading. Well, this is a perfect example of minority literature because it's all about the little man trying to negotiate. Now, one of the most interesting aspects of the story, especially for you, is the use of Slavic words. It's all over the place. All over the place. And how do they function? What is the role of all these Slavicisms? So we've already heard Obreskes. Okay, so...
Zlodiyevke.
Yeah, and Zlodiyevke. But it starts at the very beginning.
Zlodiyevke, for English, it's better to pronounce Zlodiyevke.
Zlodiyevke?
Zlodey is a thief in Ukrainian.
Zlodiyevke.
Zlodiyevke.
Ah, see, I don't know that.
And Zlodey is a thief.
I know, that I know.
So
so the accent goes on the first syllable.
yes, Zlodey. Ivan Zlodey.
Yeah.
It's easy even to pronounce.
Okay, so there you see, you taught me something very important. So, who's narrating the story? So the narrator, who is the mediator here, who considers himself extremely worldly, throws in an awful lot of Slavic words. And the technical word, and they're in quotation marks. Most of them are in quotation marks. So linguistically it means, I don't know if you ever heard this term, unmerged. These are unmerged Slavicisms. Unmerged means these are not normal words like paskudnyak, which anyone would use, but they are still in quotation marks. That means these are brand new words that are still spoken unmerged. Okay. So what are some of these unmerged Slavicism? Imenius, which is repeated over and over again. Folvarkis, Livadis, Budnikis, Chornozion. Do you even know what these words mean?
Yes.
You do, okay. Well, the average... Now, did Sholom-Aleichem think that his immigrant readers on the Lower East Side would still remember what these words meant? That's a good question. Probably in 1913, yes, because they just came off the boat. A generation later? No way. They would just know these are foreign words that have something to do with real estate. But for the storyteller, it's very important, because he's showing off what he knows. And he's also telling us something very clever. That in fact, Sholem Shachne doesn't know a hoot about real estate. He doesn't understand anything. All he has done is learn the vocabulary. He's learned the words. Yeah, he's learned to say imenius. How to actually close a deal, read it. He didn't close the deal, it was the brothers Dropkin who closed the deal. It wasn't him, it was they who did it. They just wanted to get rid of him because he talked and talked and talked and talked. He said, all right already, all right, we'll give you your cut. Just like Menachem Mendel on the stock exchange, all he ever learns is the terminology. He learns the language. He never actually learns how anything works. So Sholem Shachne, is a close cousin to Menachem Mendel. And then, of course, you have the Kolashok and the Kokarde and all of that. So, what does this tell us? It tells you that Russian here is a foreign language, and that Sholom-Alейхем is using Yiddish in a particularly powerful way. He's showing you that Russian is pretending to be the universal vehicular language. But I'm telling you, Yiddish is the language that encompasses this entire world, that can still describe it and hold it in place. And the narrator is the person who does that, because he is in complete control of the story. He knows exactly what he's doing. And it goes for Ukrainian too, because they're also speaking, there's a lot of Ukrainian dialogue. And the reader is supposed to hear the difference. Sholom-Alейхем wants to preserve the distinction between Imperial Goyish and vernacular Goyish. This has to remain within Jewish collective consciousness. As long as Yiddish is alive, then that internal multilingualism should also be preserved. This is a very ambitious story. Sholom-Alейхem is a very ambitious writer. He wants to preserve the multilingualism of that world. And then we get to this strange situation of the telegram. What is that telegram? What is this bezpremeno? What's that word doing there? Why does she get so angry at him? And what's the mistake here?
It's too long, and you pay for every letter. The first thing is money.
Yes.
The second thing, it's Loschen Goyish, Imperial Goyish, Ober mit Toes. It's
not even
wrong. It's not even Russian.
Ah, okay. So those are two good
Not Ukrainian at all, but not even Russian.
Okay. So here's the thing. We have been banging our head against the wall for 50 years about this word. What is this? And the person who figured it out is Mori Rabbi Dan Miro, my teacher, my beloved teacher, who's written many books on Sholom-Alейхem, and he's also translated Sholom-Alейхem into Hebrew, several volumes, including this story. So he was trying to translate this, and what is this? How do I translate it?
It's непременно should be, but it's not.
Oh, okay, so he knew that it was a mistake, because somebody told him this is bad Russian. But what is he trying to say? Let's translate it back into Jewish. He's saying, listen to this, and he's absolutely right about this. He's trying to say, bli neder. Ich kum bli neder ahem. Bli neder. What does that mean? This is halachic. This goes back to the rabbis. A Jew is not allowed to make an oath. You're right? This is already in the Ten Commandments. You shall never use the name of the Lord in vain. So taking an oath is very bad. It's a very bad taboo. So in order to avoid making any oath, when you make a promise, you say, bli neder. I'm promising it, but I'm not really making an oath on this. Okay? So it's verbal magic. It's a kind of verbal talisman. It's very coded. This is what I call Jew speak. This is the most coded internal way of speaking. His mistake is twofold. One is, what his wife says. What, are you crazy? How does a person say believe without fail? Are you really a master of your own fate? Of course not. You're not a master of your own fate, and if you think you are, you're going to get it. And you got punished for that. But the second reason he got punished is for trying to speak Jewish in Goyish. Trying to convey something which is so essentially part of your culture in a foreign language. And in a text message too. In a telegram. Sholom-Alейхем doesn't believe in telegrams. Sholom-Alейхem believes that this is the greatest lie of technology, that you can communicate directly, efficiently, in several words. That is in opposition to everything that he believes. Sholom-Alейхem believes the only way to communicate is through stories, through empathy, through voices within voices and tellers within tellers. So actually, we didn't even get to the other side, but one can unpack this story into 5 different voices. There are 5 distinct voices at work here. And each of them has a different dialect and a different point of view, and uses a different vocabulary. And over and above all of those voices is someone we never actually meet, who never appears. Sholom-Alейхем does appear. He's inside the story. It's very important for Sholom-Alейхем to have a presence. I'm still part of this conversation. But outside there's someone else called Solomon Rabinovich, whom we will never meet. He is the master. He is the master orchestrator. He is the one who is really pulling all the strings. This is really his story. So that's why I left for the very end. Well, so can we read this also autobiographically? And the answer is, of course you can. Why did Sholom-Aleichem name this character and give him one of his own names? Sholem Aleichem, Sholem, it's almost the same name. There's some very deep identification going on here. What is Sholom-Aleichem telling us about himself and his own crisis of identity? How come the two of them have the same biography? Namely this. In life, you only get one stroke of good luck. You only get one chance for das große Gewinns, to win the lottery. And after that, it's downhill. That's what happened to Solomon Rabinovich. He inherited his father's fortune. He became a big deal on the stock market in Kiev. And then he lost everything in 1890. And he said, from Sholom-Alейхем is geworden all of Sholom. Sholom-Alейchем became Mr. I died, and I had to start over again. So the story is really his story of what happens when you close the one real estate deal of your life and you think, I've got it, I've made it, arriving home Passover without fail. Oh no, you're not in control of your life in any way whatsoever. So this is his story too. And finally, this I leave to you. Go back and reread Gogol's The Nose, and you will see that these are 2 twin stories about a man losing the one thing that identifies him most. In one case, his nose, and in the other case, his hat. And what happens when you lose that one piece of yourself, which is the most critical to your sense of self-identity. Sholom-Alейchem was a very close reader of Gogol, but he also needed to neutralize him. So there is almost no supernatural in his stories. And the devil does not appear and it's not, supernatural does not figure in his stories the way it does in Gogol. But I think this story was written in conversation with him. It seems very clear to me that that's what is also happening here. Sholom-Alейchem is creating a new model for humor and comedy, which does not have Gogol's sinister, satanic, supernatural element. It's much more of a communal story. Okay, so many choices here. We can read the story and see Sholem as a social, psychological type, or as the hero of a folk tale. We can read it as a railroad story, as a story of exile, or we can read it as a story of homecoming. We can read it as a form of minority discourse, or as an example of Jew-speak, which is a Jewish discourse which is the sum of all languages. It's all the languages rolled into one. It is 5 narratives, one after the other, and one inside the other. It's not that these are 5 sequential stories. That's why I did it this way. It's a Chinese box. It's a voice within a voice within a voice within a voice. It's not one after the other. They're all embedded within each other. Or, and finally, we can read it as a story about Solomon Rabinovich in exile and wanting to come home, at least in his imagination. Or Sholom-Alейхем at the height of his career, feeling that he can do anything, anything is possible, and creating a new comic tradition out of everything, out of the best that came before him. All in one story. That's it.